Before we begin, can I ask you a small favor? If you enjoy calm, weird stories like this, the kind no one else tells, please hit subscribe right now. It's free. It takes 1 second, but it tells me to keep going, to keep digging up the strange, forgotten corners of history and turning them into quiet, sleepy documentaries for you. And if you're feeling generous, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is. You might be surprised. How many people are listening with you right now, somewhere else in the dark down? Let's begin. Asterisk, somewhere in the year 1263. In a narrow valley nestled deep within the Rhineland, the bells of St. Hildegard's convent rang far too late. No one knew why at first. The morning prayers, meant to welcome the rising sun, came when it was already high, and vespers, usually sung just as the sky began to purple, were whispered in near-darkness for weeks. The timing was wrong. Sister Bertha noticed it first, though she said nothing. She was not the abbess, nor the sacristan, nor even a novice mistress, just a quiet figure with a bent back, always in the herb garden or the cellar. But she had a habit of listening, just to the nuns, but to the earth beneath their feet. And it was from the earth that she got her idea. The convent, like many others in medieval Europe, kept time not with clocks. Those were rare and wildly expensive, but with more primitive instruments. The sun was the truest guide, followed by candle clocks, sundials, and even dripping water. But clouds ruined sundials. Candle wax melted unevenly in summer, and water froze in the long Rhineland winters. Bertha's idea was simpler, stranger, rooted in the very vegetables she tended. She had always noticed how turnips changed texture as they aged. A fresh turnip, straight from the ground, was firm. After a day, it softened. After 2, it shrank. It was subtle, but measurable. If you left a row of turnips on the stone shelf of the cellar, each would shrink just a little more than the one beside it. Time, she reasoned, was something that even vegetables could measure. She just had to listen. She told no one at first. She simply lined up 7 turnips identical, in size across a wooden plank in the cool storage room. Each day at dawn, she checked the softness, the weight, and the scent. She pinched the skin lightly, recorded it with scratch marks on an old clay shard. At night, she lit a candle and repeated the test. It was absurd, and she knew it, but something about it felt reliable. Meanwhile, the bell ringer, Sister Agnes, struggled. Her water clock had frozen again. The abbess was growing irritated. Morning prayers were held in bright light, evening hymns in near blackness. The rhythm of devotion was off, and that meant the rhythm of life itself was disrupted. Monastic life depended on precision. The divine office had to be recited at the correct intervals, and if time slipped, so did the soul. Sister Bertha waited until one cold morning, when the firewood ran low, and even the candles burned unpredictably. She made her quiet offer. "I believe," she said to the abbess, "that I can tell you when prime should begin. The turnips have shown me." The abbess stared. There were rules about visions, and Bertha had never been one for dreams. She was too practical, too earthy, but something in her tone was calm, reasoned. The abbess, desperate and curious, permitted an experiment. That night, Sister Bertha was given charge of announcing Compline, the last prayer of the day. No clocks, no bell schedule, just her and the turnips. She stood in the courtyard, eyes on the stars, but fingers on the turnip batch. She whispered the names she had given them: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, until she reached the one that felt right, not too soft, not too hard. She lit the signal candle. The bell rang. The sisters gathered and for the first time in weeks, Compline felt right, not too late, not too early. The shadows were in their proper place. The prayers echoed softly off the stone, and the wind was calm. From that day, the abbess quietly allowed Sister Bertha's vegetable clock to guide the hours. Of course, it was never made official. That would have bordered on the heretical letting vegetables decide the rhythm of prayer. But Sister Agnes began asking Bertha for her gut feeling before ringing the bells. And that gut, it seemed, was very reliable. The method wasn't perfect. On some days, the turnips seemed off, too fast, too slow. Bertha adjusted. She added variables: room temperature, root thickness, air moisture. She even experimented with radishes and beets, but nothing quite matched the humble turnip. Eventually, the younger nuns began whispering about her, not in mockery, but in awe. She knows the time by touch, they'd say. She reads the hours in the root. One girl even asked if the turnips could be trained to speak. Sister Bertha chuckled. No, child, but they listen, and that's more than most people do. Still, not everyone was pleased. The sacristan, in particular a precise woman who preferred iron candle gauges, saw Bertha's method as dangerously unorthodox. Next, you'll be telling me she counts time by bread mold, she grumbled once. Bertha only smiled. And yet, something strange began to happen. Over time, Bertha's turnip logs showed irregularities, changes in the rate of softening that didn't match the seasons. Some ripened faster in the cellar than they should have. Others, left on identical stones, aged differently. She began to suspect that the vegetables were responding not just to time, but to sound, to prayer, to the rhythm of footsteps above. She started placing different root vegetables under different rooms: the chapel, the scriptorium, the dormitorium, tracking their changes. And slowly, quietly, an odd question took root in her mind. Were the turnips truly measuring time? Or were they measuring something else entirely, something human, something holy, something unseen? Sister Bertha became a curiosity within the convent. Quietly, of course. No one dared openly challenge the sacristan's candle gauges or Sister Agnes's water clock. But when timings slipped, when the sun betrayed them with too early rays, or clouds dulled the skies, signal there was always one calm voice asked to weigh in. Bertha whispered Sister Maria one morning, as frost glazed the cloister walls. Does the turnip agree its lords? It was said half-jokingly, but the respect behind the humor was real. By now, Bertha had refined her method. She had notebooks, hidden, crude, and stitched from scraps of vellum discarded by the scriptorium. Inside were tiny marks, days, weights, softness levels, smells. She kept her samples in stone bowls labeled by location: chapel, dormitory, kitchen, garden door, and one simply called south wall. Each vegetable was rotated, tested, and replaced after 5 days. Too long, and they became soup. Too short, and they didn't settle, as she called it. But what disturbed her now was not decay. It was inconsistency. 2 turnips, pulled from the same bed, stored side by side in the same room, would age differently depending on what was happening above them. She charted it, noticed patterns. A turnip stored under the chapel seemed to shrink slightly more during days when the sisters chanted extra psalms. The ones under the dormitory responded strangely to fasting days. During Lent, they softened faster. It made no sense. She even tried keeping a control group outside the convent walls, hidden near the garden under an overturned pot, untouched by human footsteps or prayer, and they behaved normally, predictably dull. It was the ones inside the convent that acted strangely, pled. They responded to rhythm. She began to wonder if what she was measuring wasn't time at all, but the beat of monastic life itself. And that was when Sister Agnetha fell ill, a beloved but frail woman. Agnetha had served as infirmarian for nearly 2 decades. She was the one who knew which herbs soothed fevers, which teas cured stomachs, and which root tinctures helped with grief. One morning, she simply didn't rise. Fever, labored breath. The abyss sent for nearby clerics, but they could offer only prayer. The convent slipped into a subtle panic, and that's when the turnips changed. Again, Bertha noticed it 3 days into Agnetha's illness. The vegetable under the infirmary was shrinking faster than any she'd measured. Much faster. It wasn't logical it hadn't been touched, moved, or exposed to different air. But something had shifted, as if it, too, were absorbing the worry above. The hushed voices, the heavy footfalls, the lingering incense of desperate prayer. And when Agnetha passed away on the 7th day, the turnip in her cellar bowl had gone, almost entirely soft, faster than any record Bertha had. She didn't mention it, but she marked it down. Not just the rate of decay, the moment of death. From that point on, Sister Bertha became obsessed, not with timekeeping, but with resonance, with how the movements of people, breath, voice, sorrow affected the materials of the earth beneath them. Her methods became stranger. She soaked one turnip in holy water and left another dry. One she placed beneath the floor during compline, another during Mass. She even began praying over a few herself. Soft chants, repeated psalms, always the same, within 3 days. The turnips she prayed over softened faster than the control. Always, without exception, was it warmth. The breath was the sound of the words breaking down their fibers. She had no answers, only patterns. And in a monastery, patterns were everything. It was during one of these experiments that she caught the attention of Father Thomas, a visiting monk from a nearby Benedictine abbey. He'd been sent to review their records, inspect the convents, apply pre-holdings, and verify the accuracy of their prayer schedule. "Curious," he murmured, flipping through one of Bertha's makeshift logs one afternoon after stumbling upon it in the cellar. This ... This is vegetable decay. Bertha hesitated. "It's something like that." He raised an eyebrow. "You're measuring God's time in tubers." She flushed, but did not retract. "I am observing what happens when human rhythm meets Earth's silence. The vegetables respond. That is all." Instead of ridicule, Thomas nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're not measuring time," he said. "Perhaps you're measuring presence." It stuck with her. Presence. For what is monastic life but presence? Repetition. Stillness. A kind of quiet pressure that hums through the walls. Day after day. Year after year. Bertha expanded her work. She began using 2 different routes, at once placing one under the dormitory of novices, full of restless dreams and whispered doubts, and another under the cloister path where the elder nuns walked in silence. The difference was always clear. The novices, Turnips, aged faster, always. And she wondered, could the vegetables sense fear? Hope, faith. It was absurd, blasphemous even, but it didn't feel unholy. It felt ... revealing. She began to think less of time as a line and more like a pressure, a subtle breath that the convent exhaled and inhaled with every prayer, every footstep, every secret confession and small smile exchanged during dishwashing. She stopped calling them turnip clocks. Now she simply called them listeners. But not all the sisters saw it that way. When word began to spread beyond the convent, when an apprentice monk from Father Thomas's abbey asked whether it was true that a nun at St. Hildegard's could speak to vegetables, concern rose. Fast that abbess, though tolerant, feared scrutiny. The bishop's court had recently condemned a local healer for vegetal heresy, a woman who claimed rosemary could dream. They weren't far from those dangerous murmurs. Bertha was summoned. Her logs burned. "I believe you mean no harm," the abbess said gently. "But you must not teach what the church does not yet understand." Bertha nodded. She did not argue. But that night, in silence, she retrieved a single unburned page. The page that had recorded Agnetha's final week. She folded it carefully, placed it in a jar, and buried it beneath the convent's oldest tree. And the next morning, she returned to her herb work, silent, observant, unquestioned. Still, there was one final anomaly. The turnip she'd buried beneath the altar one she'd forgotten about for weeks was uncovered accidentally during floor repair. It had not rotted. It had dried, preserved, as if held in time by something ... else. What had the altar preserved? Why had this one root not aged like the rest? And did this mean time itself could pause? Asterisk, by the time Sister Bertha entered her 23rd year at St. Hildegard's, the turnip experiments had become a part of her past, at least outwardly. The journals were gone. The cellar shelves now held dried lentils and jars of goose fat, not vegetable listeners for softening radishes. Her role had returned to what it always was, the convent's herbalist. Quiet, invisible, useful. But she had not forgotten, and the turnip beneath the altar had not decayed. It had been found during a minor repair in the chapel floor, a loose tile that a carpenter priest was asked to stabilize. When they lifted the stone slab near the tabernacle, they found it buried shallow in a small jar of clay, sealed only by wax and time. Sister Agnes, still the bell ringer, recognized it immediately. She'd seen Bertha bury it once, years ago, during a quiet afternoon when no one was meant to be in the chapel. She said nothing at the time, but now she retrieved it, and without ceremony handed it back. "You ought to see this," she whispered. The turnip, once pale and moist, was now grayish and dry to the touch, but not moldy, not shriveled, not decomposed. It had mummified, dratained its shape. The soft grooves of Bertha's pinched test marks, still faintly visible. A perfect memory of the moment it had been planted, and yet it had aged. Bertha weighed. It was lighter than it had been, as if the water had left but the soul remained. She placed it on her shelf, not as a relic, as a reminder, and she began to think again about time. What had made this route so different? Was it the location, the ritual, the proximity to consecrated objects? She thought of all the nights she'd sat in the chapel, whispering prayers with her fingers curled in her lap, unspoken grief pressing behind her teeth. The altar had witnessed all of it, and maybe the turnip had too. She did not resume the experiments, not in the way she once had. There were eyes now, whispers. A younger nun, Sister Lutgard, had already written to a nearby bishop's scribe, asking whether a dowsing violated Canon. Bertha had no interest in scandal. But she began to write again. Not charts this time, not observations, but reflections, quiet thoughts about the nature of rhythm, decay, and the space between prayer and silence. She asked questions in her notes, and sometimes did not attempt to answer them. Why does soft sound change the pace? Preach. Why does fasting age root vegetables faster under the dormitory? What rhythm does the earth keep when no one is listening? She recalled a moment from her youth, before she'd entered the convent, when her mother used to test if bread was done by knocking on its bottom. It should sound hollow, she said, like a prayer without words. And now Bertha wondered if her own prayers, unvoiced and unwritten, had hollowed out something inside her, made her a better listener, better keeper of strange rhythms. It was then that something changed in the convent again. The bells began to misalign once more, not by much, a few minutes, but enough for the elder nuns to notice. The water clock had started dripping too slowly. The candle gauges no longer burned evenly, some stuttered, some flared. Sister Agnes, now older and slower, found herself ringing the bells with a touch of doubt in her eyes. And one morning, long before prime, Bertha was asked to come to the abbess's chamber. "She is gone," the abbess said simply. Sister Agnes had passed away in her sleep. It was quiet, natural, but the loss was seismic. No one else knew the bells like she had. No one else remembered the rhythm of each prayer. The little adjustments she'd made with her body to account for slow wax or errant drips. The convent was suddenly UNMORED. And so, for the second time in her life, Bertha was asked to assist, quietly, temporarily. "We know it's not official," the abbess said, "but you've always known when it feels right." And so Bertha returned not to the cellar, but to the rhythm. She didn't line up new turnips or scratch tallies into clay. She simply listened, stood in the chapel at dawn, smelled the air, touched the cool stone, measured the hush before the birds stirred, and rang the bell. It was perfect. The sisters, many too young to remember her first experiments, began to defer to her gently. "Is it time for sext? Does it feel like vespers today?" And Bertha, instead of looking at the sky, would rest her fingers on the stone windowsill, where the sun warmed it just enough, and nod. A rhythm doesn't need measuring once it's inside you. Years passed. She never taught her method, never wrote it down. But she whispered it once to a young novice who had trouble sleeping. "You'll know what time it is," she said, "when the stone under your hand and the beat in your chest agree. When your breath feels like it belongs to the world, not to you." The novice never forgot it. Eventually, the convent added a mechanical clock, gifted by a distant noble family. It struck its first bell with a proud clang that startled the hens. But some said it was never quite right, even when the gears turned, even when the hands pointed true. The hours felt often till Sister Bertha quietly corrected them, not by oiling the COGS, just by standing in the hallway, looking at the light on the wall and nodding. She died at the age of 67 while organizing a pile of dried sage bundles. The convent buried her with no grand ceremony, just a simple pine box. But when they laid her down, a young nun tucked something into the coffin, the preserved turnip from under the altar, still firm, still silent, a memory of rhythm, and no one ever quite knew why. But that year, the bell always rang at just the right moment, not because someone measured, but because someone remembered. Reflection: was Sister Bertha truly keeping time more, simply bearing witness to the rhythm of others? Can the essence of a place its size, its prayers, its small griefs imprint themselves into things as simple as a vegetable? And what else might be quietly recording our lives, right beneath our feet? Asterisk, the rule of Saint Benedict, so often quoted and rarely questioned, prescribed a life of divine rhythm, 7 prayers a day, each separated by careful pauses. The prayers had names: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. To a medieval nun, these were not mere calendar entries. They were the bones of the day, the scaffolding of sacred routine. But time, in the 13th century, was slippery. Asterisk. Sister Onlin discovered this first during Lent. She had been entrusted with waking the convent in time for matins, the dark hour office before dawn. The bell ringer was ill, and the abbess believed Onlin was sensitive to sacred flow, which was a poetic way of saying she woke up early, yet without a bell or clock. How was she to know when it was truly time? She tried counting slowly in her head. She tried listening for the cock's crow, but the convent's rooster was notoriously inconsistent. She once rose to pray 3 hours early. Another time she was late, and the abbess's cold silence lasted for days. Time was not a thing to guess at. It was a thing to feel, and so Anlin turned to the only objects that never betrayed her. Beans dot in the convent storeroom. Next to sacks of barley and spoiled leeks, there sat a basket of dried fava beans, smooth, heavy, reliable. She took 12, one night washed, dried, and kept them in a cloth pouch beneath her habit. She had noticed something odd during kitchen duty months earlier. It took her about 37 seconds to whisper a full Hail Mary at her usual pace. If she whispered 12 of them, slowly and prayerfully, it passed about 7.5 minutes. It was just enough time to prepare herself for the chapel that night. Sister Anlin began to count time with prayer and beans. She slipped a bean from the left side of the pouch to the right after each prayer. Eyes closed, breath steady. 12 Hail Marys. Then the signal. Time to ring the waking bell. It wasn't scientific. It wasn't sanctioned, but it worked. And thus began the bean-counting hours of St. Everelda's Abbey. The beans were soon joined by others, sisters. Sabina borrowed the idea to manage her own prayer cycles, though she used small pebbles, claiming, "Bet God made stone before seed." Sister Clara tried using lentils, but complained they rolled away too icily. Eventually, many sisters adopted their own counting method, but Anlin's was the most precise. She began marking time for everything: the length of communal silence after compliment, the time between dawn and the first call to work, even the pauses between verses in sung psalms. Each activity had a different bean-count, and over time she began to experiment. If she whispered the Pater Noster instead of the Hail Mary, how long did that take? Was it consistent across moods? What about if she sang it softly instead? She created charts. On recycled parchment, she tallied her average pacing, the number of syllables per breath, the seconds between transitions. She even marked how humidity affected her rhythm on cold days. She slowed unconsciously. On hot days, she rushed. The abbess noticed, not disapprovingly, but with mild curiosity. "You keep time with beans and breath," she said once. "Perhaps you'll measure the Holy Spirit next." Anlin only smiled. But the real test came during Advent. A traveling bishop passing through the region had stopped at St. Everilda's on his way to Cologne. The sisters were instructed to prepare a special dawn mass. The problem: his guards arrived 3 hours earlier than expected. Before the convent had woken, chaos rippled through the cloister. The bell-ringer was still asleep. The candles weren't lit. The bread hadn't risen, and it was Sister Anlin, bleary-eyed and clutching her pouch of beans, who noticed the glint of torches outside. Without a word, she began her sequence: 12 Hail Marys. A silent breath. She signaled Sister Clara to light the chapel. Sister Sabina to begin the incense. By the time the bishop crossed the threshold, the candles were burning, the nuns were gathered, and the silence of the chapel echoed like prepared holiness. The abbess said nothing, but Anlin's pouch was replaced the next day with one embroidered, in red threaden unofficial acknowledgement. Time had been kept, not by the sun, not by bells, but by devotion and legumes. Still, not everyone was content. Sister Bruna, the sacristan, viewed the practice as crude. "We are not merchants weighing grain," she once hissed. "Let the sun and bells guide us, not peasant pockets." But Anlin knew that the sun could be hidden, the bells could freeze. The body, though its breath, its voice, its rhythm, was always present. She even began teaching novices to regulate themselves. "Find your pace," she whispered. "One breath per word. Don't rush. God is not in a hurry." And it worked. One girl, Sister Jezebel, who struggled with anxiety and often stumbled during group prayers, found comfort in her beans. Each transfer was an anchor, a silent note of calm. The abbess, once again, allowed it to continue. But not all signs were simple. One night, during a particularly long vigil, Anlin noticed something odd. After completing her 12th bean, she felt it in her hand, ... still cold. Too cold. She hadn't warmed it by touch, though she had been holding it throughout prayer. It was, in fact, a pebble, one of Sister Sabina's. She was confused. How had it gotten into her pouch? In the morning, she checked again. 2 more had switched. Her beans were being replaced, slowly, one by one. She said nothing. She began to track it. Over the next month, half of her pouch became stones, and with them something strange began to happen. Her rhythm, ... faltered. The prayers rushed. The breathing grew shallow. The bell sounded a few minutes early. Then, a few minutes late, it was not sabotaged. It was subtle, unconscious, but it disrupted everything. When she replaced the beans with fresh ones, the rhythm returned. She tested this. Over weeks, she alternated between pouches stone-heavy ones, fresh beans, aged beans, peas, and she discovered something quietly powerful. Each material shaped her rhythm. Beans gave her calm precision. Stones brought tension. Lentils made her rush. Dried berries slowed her. It was not the object's weight, but its feel. She wondered, was she measuring time, or was time measuring her? And if her rhythm could be thrown by a pebble, how fragile was devotion itself? After the pebble incident, Sister Anlin began to see the beans differently. They were no longer just tools for marking time. They were quiet companions, each with its own texture, weight, and mood. She became more selective. Not just any bean would do. The most faithful ones, she found, were slightly oval, dappled, and smooth, not too large, not too dry. She started pressing them between her fingers during quiet walks, feeling for the right softness. Anlin wasn't alone in this quiet obsession. Several other sisters had also begun to rely on physical objects to help them through the hours. Sister Jezebel continued using beans to calm her nerves before prayers. Sister Clara began using dried rose hips, claiming their scent helped her stay focused during matins. The abbess allowed it, but only in private. Outwardly, the convent was to present the image of proper Benedictine order. Bells, chants, sundot, but in private cells and quiet corners, there were whispers and counting. Anlin, now regarded as the silent guardian of rhythm, was called upon when timings slipped. The candle clock had begun to fail again. Wicks were burning unevenly, and the wax was too thin to mark time properly. The bell for sext rang during terce, and Sister Bruna blamed a warped sundial. The abbess asked Anlin to step in temporarily until the next solstice, when the sunlight might behave again. Anlin did not refuse, but she did ask one thing: to sit in the chapel alone each evening, just after Compline, with no distractions, no visitors, just her beans, a bench, and the faint rustle of the wind through the iron lattice windows. The abbess agreed. That's when Anlin began to hear it. It was not a sound in the usual sense, more like the memory of one, a long echo, deep and slow, like the resonance of stone struck by a velvet hammer. It wasn't audible to the other sisters, but Anlin felt it in her chest, especially when she prayed slowly, rhythmically, with beans slipping from hand to hand in the dark dot. It was always the same. On the 12th bean, just as the last syllable of her final prayer left her lips, the sound would rise from the silence. Not every night, only when she was calm, still empty. She called it the shadow tone. It lingered like incense. She tried, telling Sister Jezebel, but the younger nun only nodded politely, unsure what to make of it. Sister Bruna scoffed when Anlin hinted at the sound. Perhaps your stomach is echoing your emptiness, she said dryly, but Anlin knew what she felt. She began keeping another chart knot of minutes or prayers, but of tone nights. She marked down weather conditions, meals eaten, the emotional atmosphere of the day, and the type of beans used. She noticed that tone nights never occurred after arguments. They never came after a feast day. They only came on days of total stillness. One evening, she tried to replicate the tone using pebbles instead of beans. It didn't come. Another evening, she replaced the prayer with a whispered psalm. Dot. Still nothing. Only when she used the right beans. The ones she'd warmed between her hands for hours, and whispered the exact same prayer 12 times. Did it return? The 12th time. The final word. The echo. Asterisk. What was it? She tried stopping her 12th prayer early one night, leaving it unfinished. The tone didn't come. Another time. She whispered a 13th. Still silence. Only 12. Always 12. Was it the prayer, or the number, or something else entirely? Word began to spread among the younger sisters. Not about the tone, they never heard it, but about Sister Anlin's precision. Her prayer bells, when she was permitted to lead, seemed to ring at just the right moment, not by the sun, not by the clock, but by a sense. The rhythm of the room, the feel of breath, the way the chapel stones shifted their warmth after the final candle went out. They trusted her. And with trust came imitation. Soon, novices were given bean pouches on their first day. Not officially, but Sister Jezebel had taken up the mantle, teaching them how to count slowly, how to feel each breath, how to match heartbeat to word. But even as her influence grew, Annlyn became quieter. The tone was returning more frequently now, but it had changed. It was no longer a soft echo. It had weight, depth. One night it came with a rush of wind that blew out her candle, though the windows were shut. Another time it brought a sharp, metallic scent to her nose. She began to wonder if she was truly hearing something or being heard. Then came the dream. Annlyn saw herself in a room lined with sacks of grains. She sat alone on a stool, whispering the Hail Mary with her beans. But each time she dropped a bean from one hand to the other, it turned into a seed, not just a metaphorical one, a true, pulsing, living seed. Roots burst from the bottom, shoots from the top. The moment she finished the 12th, the ground cracked, and the entire room bloomed with flowers, each marked with Roman numerals on their petals. She woke, gasping, the pouch in her hand. All 12 beans had sprouted tiny cracks. She planted them. Within days, green tendrils emerged. Only those 12. None of the others she tested responded the same. She told no one, but she stopped using the beans. After that, not because she feared them, but because she respected them. Her final rhythm in her final years was internal. No pouch, no breath counting. Just silence. She no longer needed objects. Her body remembered when asked how she knew the right moment to rise for matins. She would simply say, "The air tells me," and the others believed her. She died in spring, by a hazel tree. No great bell rang, no clock chimed, but the sisters, all of them, looked up from their work at the same moment 12 minutes before. Primand turned toward the chapel. They didn't know why. They simply knew. Reflection. What if time is not something we keep, but something that keeps us? What rhythms lie beneath our prayers, our breath, our stillness? And when we listen closely, who or what is listening back? Asterisk. After Sister Annlyn's passing, the bean pouches remained. They were folded neatly in the novices' dormitory drawers, tucked inside devotional books, or sewn into the hems of habits. Most had no idea where the tradition began. They only knew it helped them breathe, helped them count, helped them pray. The abbess, now older and often confined to her room, didn't question it anymore. Not when the bells rang true. Not when the sisters moved through the hours with a quiet, shared rhythm that felt older than sunlight. But Sister Jezebel remembered. She had been there when Annlyn first explained her system with gentle hands and fewer words. She had been the one to carry Annlyn's last pouch. And when the time came to lay her to rest beneath the hazel tree near the south wall, she asked to handle the burial herself. Annlyn had no official grave marker. That was convent custom. But Jezebel planted 12 bean seeds over the site. The same kind, the same texture, not a holy ritual, just a rhythm. And every spring they sprouted at first, It seemed unremarkably and well-tended garden might give life to beans. But these did not behave like others. They grew in a perfect arc, never more, never less than 12 plants. Even when squirrels dug around them, even when a late frost killed the rest of the vegetable beds, they always returned, and they always bloomed with the faint patentiny markings on the stems and pods that some sisters claimed resembled tally marks, dots, or even Roman numerals. No one knew what to make of them. Jezebel said nothing. She simply tended them. Years later, a new sacristan arrived, Sister Magdalena, young and eager, trained in liturgical rigor. She brought with her books, charts, and a portable sun compass, gifted by a merchant monk. She did not understand the beans. She found them scattered on chapel benches, sewn into habits, even glued to the cover of a novice's psalter. She issued a decree: no more vegetable counting. Time must be measured by sun and bell, not superstition. Most obeyed. Jezebel did not. Not in defiance, but in memory. She said nothing, but resumed her silent, nightly visits to the hazel tree. And then something odd happened. The bells began ringing off-beat again. Just a few minutes at first. Vespers creeping into Compline, matins slipping too early. The sundial read correctly. The compass pointed right, but the feeling was wrong. A subtle disharmony settled over the convent. Meals grew rushed. Hymns overlapped. The sisters didn't say anything outright, but they stopped sleeping as soundly. Even the birds outside began chirping at odd hours. Jezebel waited quietly. Then, one morning, without announcement, she walked into the chapel at prime, placed a single bean on the stone near the altar, and whispered a prayer. She did it again the next day, and again on the third day. The abbess, now frail and nearly blind, sent for her. "Are the hours misaligned?" she asked. Jezebel nodded. "And what do you propose?" "Let me listen," Jezebel said. "I'll need 12 days and 12 seeds." What followed became known, in whispers, as the days of the quiet bell. Jezebel stopped using the tower bell entirely. She rose early, walked the cloister, measured the silence, not by clocks, not by sun, but by rhythm. She returned to Anlin's method, not copied, not imitated, but remembered in feeling. On the 12th day, she rang the bell by hand. At the exact moment, the east-facing stones turned gold. No one had told her. No one had watched. But everyone knew that it was the right time. From then on, Sister Magdalena allowed the beans to return, unofficially, quietly, but they returned. New pouches appeared. New prayers began with soft clicking, sounds in the dark. The novices found comfort in the weight of them reminders of breath, rhythm, and presence. And every year, 12 new plants bloomed beneath the hazel tree. Some claimed the stems grew in curves resembling the letter M. For others saw the shape of hands in prayer. One novice said the leaves seemed to rustle differently on holy days, but no one tried to explain it too much, because in the end, it wasn't about belief or miracle. It was about rhythm, the kind you feel in your bones when the wind passes through cloister arches, when a bell echoes just long enough to settle behind your heart, when a prayer ends and something stirs inside you. An answer you weren't asking for, a rhythm that doesn't need measuring, only remembering, reflection. What is time, if not a shared breath? Can a bean passed from hand to hand carry not just seconds but silence, grief, comfort, and trust? And in a world without clocks, could it be that rhythm is the holiest thing of all? Asterisk in the year 1217, in the hills above a small Flemish town called Dendermonde, a convent stood where the bell rang 15 minutes before the hour, every hour for 7 years. No one quite knew why. The tower itself was sound, stone laid with care by a local mason and funded by a generous widow. Its wooden stairs creaked predictably. The bronze bell, forged in Ghent, bore a Latin inscription that read ad vigilias, nan, ad vanitate, for vigils, not for vanity. It had been blessed, sprinkled, measured, but still, it rang too early. The nuns of St. Arildus Abbey adjusted. At first, they tightened their schedules, rose slightly earlier, ate when their stomachs weren't yet ready, chanted before the world outside was quiet enough to hear them. They whispered complaints only in confession, but slowly the mood shifted. Prayer is a rhythm, and rhythm, when broken, breaks everything, even the kitchen servants, who were not bound by the divine office, began to notice their bread rising unevenly. The stable boy, tasked with cleaning the courtyard each morning, found the animals restless before Dornas, though they, too, had learned to distrust the bell. At the center of it all stood Sister Merencia, the tower's guardian. She was not the abbess, nor the sacristan, just a nun with strong legs and a head for height. Her duty was simple: ascend the tower 5 times a day and ring the bell at the prescribed moments. She had followed the rules exactly. Her counting was exact, her pace timed by her own steady breath, as trained by Sister Bruna before her. She even checked the sun each day from the narrow tower window to be sure she wasn't too early. But still, the bell was wrong. It must be the air, she said quietly one evening to the abbess. The air. The abbess raised a tired brow. Marie hesitated. The wind, perhaps. It pulls the sound forward. The abbess sighed. Sound is not a horse to be led. But she allowed the investigation. Asterisk. Sister Merencia began her own quiet study. She descended from the tower and began observing instead, listening first from the west wall of the chapel, then from the courtyard, then from the small root cellar, where the sound of the bell arrived. Faint and late, she counted. She timed. She discovered that the bell could not be trusted at all distances. Closer to the tower, the ringing always felt early, but farther away in the scriptorium or gardenet sounded just right. In fact, one elderly sister who had gone deaf in her left ear said she always felt the bell arrive precisely when her bones expected it. The problem wasn't the bell. The problem was the air. That winter, A traveling cantor named Brother Yu passed through, seeking shelter on his way to Liege. He stayed for 3 nights, and on the second, Sister Merencia asked him about sound. Can it change? She asked. Can it lie? Ewald smiled gently. Sound does not lie, but it travels slowly, and it listens to wind. That struck her. Sound listens to wind. She climbed the tower again that evening, just before Vesper. This time, she didn't ring the bell. She stood with her hand on the rope and watched the trees below. The wind was strong and moving east. She dropped a small pebble from the tower's ledge and watched it fall at a sharp angle. Then she rang. The bell dot from the tower. It sounded early. From the cloister below, one sister shouted, perfect timing. It made no sense. Unless sound, she realized, could arrive before the moment it was meant to be heard. She recorded it in a small wax tablet. Wind from east. Bell sounds right in cloister. Early at tower. She began tracking it daily. Wind direction. Bell timing. Auditory delay. She found a pattern. When the wind came from the west, the bell sounded late. From the east, early. She consulted no books. There were none in the convent that discussed acoustics, but in her bones, she knew she was right. She adjusted her ringing accordingly, waiting longer when the wind pulled sound fast, ringing sooner. When it dragged, the other sisters noticed immediately. The rhythm felt smooth again. The prayers realigned, and the abbess said nothing. That was praise enough. But something strange happened that spring. The bell began to ring on its own. Only once. It was just before prime. The sisters had not yet gathered. The sky was still. Dot, and then 3 soft chimes. Sister Merencia was still in bed. She ran to the tower. Nothing. No wind. No one. The rope was still tied. The bell hung motionless. She descended in silence. No one else had heard it except Sister Lidwina, who had been tending to the fire in the kitchen. I thought it was my imagination, she said. It sounded so soft, like it was afraid to wake me. Merencia said nothing. She checked the tower again, found no faults. But for the first time, she felt unsettled, as though the bell had developed preference. That week, the air changed. The wind, no longer came from the east or west, but turned in slow circle. The weather was strange. The bell's timing, even with her adjustments, faltered. And on the 7th night, it rang again alone. This time at midnight, and this time every sister heard it. They gathered in the chapel, confused. No one had touched the rope. The bell had chosen its own hour. Reflection. Can a bell ring early when no one pulls its rope? Does sound belong to the ringer, to the air that carries it? And if time is told by tone, what happens when tone decides to speak on its own? Asterisk. After the second midnight ringing, a peculiar hush settled over St. Arilda's Abbey. Not fear exactly, no. One spoke of demons or signs, but a quiet reluctance to discuss what had happened. The bell had rung when no one had touched it. Once is a mistake. Twice is a pattern. Sister Merencia couldn't sleep. She sat upright on her straw-stuffed mattress and listened not to voices, but to the faint hum of the convent. A building like this has its own breath. Beams crack as they settle. Floors whisper as they contract with the night. But what she was listening for wasn't wood or wind. She was listening for tone, the kind that seemed to arrive just before the bell. She didn't know what to call it. It wasn't quite a sound, not a ringing in the ears, just a sense of pressure, like the air before a storm. And then the bell would follow by the end of the week. It had happened 5 times, each time between midnight and matins, each time when the wind stood still, each time when no one had rung it. The abbess finally summoned Sister Merencia. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I haven't touched it," Merencia said honestly, "and yet it rings." "I think," Merencia said slowly, "the tower is remembering." The abbess stared at her. Remembering. Merencia hesitated, or listening. The bell, she explained, had developed its own sense of rhythm. Not random, not haunting. Predictable, but only if one listened carefully. It rang on nights of perfect stillness, when no one whispered, no one moved, and the convent was aligned. In a kind of breathless peace, the bell, she believed, had grown used to the rhythm of prayer, of ritual, of song. And when the silence stretched too long, when no voices had touched the chapel, walls for hours it rang to remind them it wasn't haunting, it was habit. The abbess was not comforted. "We are not to be ruled by metal," she said. "You will lock the rope in the tower after Compline. Take the key to your cell." Merencia obeyed. But that night, at exactly 2:11 a.m., the bell rang again, only once, a deep, slow note, a calling. They investigated the tower. The rope was still tied, the door locked, no footprints, no wind. The bell had moved, and so the sisters stopped going near it after sunset. Even Merencia avoided it, though it had once been her favorite place to think. She still timed the hours by sun, wind, and instinct, but she no longer climbed the tower unless she had to. The bell had become something else now, not malevolent, just awake. Then came the week of fog. It arrived like a spill-thick, white, wet. The entire hillside was swallowed. Even the sun could not break through. The sundial stood useless. The kitchen fires smoked. The chickens stopped laying dot, and the bell went silent completely. For 4 days, no wind, no unprompted chimes, only a stillness that felt heavier than the fog itself. The sisters began to whisper. "It has gone mute," Sister Bruna suggested, reblessing. Sister Ledwina wondered if it had simply lost interest. But Merencia thought differently. The bell wasn't mute, it was waiting. On the 5th night, just before prime, the fog lifted, not gradually, but all at once. The courtyard cleared like a breath had been taken, and the bell rang 7 times. No one was in the tower. No one was holding the rope. But it rang clear, strong, deliberate. The sisters gathered. No one spoke. And then it rang once more. A small tone, not a command, Not a summons, a question. Merencia approached the tower alone the next day. She ascended the steps, slowly, one hand trailing the stone. The bell hung, as always, still, unassuming, but the rope had swayed, only slightly, just enough, she placed, her hand on it warm. Not from sun, not from memory, she began to speak, not a prayer, not a hymn, just a whisper. Why do you ring when we sleep? There was no reply, just stillness. And then one deep creak from the beam above, as though the bell was settling into its own memory, as if to say, because you forget. That night she asked the abbess for permission. Let me try something, she said. What? Let me listen, instead of ringing. The abbess hesitated, but she allowed it. And for the first time in the convent's history, no one rang the bell for matins, and yet at exactly the right moment. It rang itself, once, then silence, then footsteps. Every sister woke without hesitation, teased without confusion, as if they'd been waiting. From then on, a new rhythm began. Sister Merencia no longer rang the bell on windy days, or during thunderstorms, or when the fog pressed too thick. She waited, and sometimes the bell rang itself. Not always, but enough to trust. And when it didn't ring, she knew something in the air was off. A mood, a silence, a dissonance in the breath of the walls. She adjusted accordingly. She became not a bell ringer, but a bell listener. Years later, when a new convent was founded nearby, they invited her to teach them how to keep time. They had sundials, candles, sandglasses. She brought none of those, only her hands, her silence, and her memory of the air. She told them one thing: you don't teach a bell to ring. You teach yourself to listen for when it wants to speak. Reflection. Can a structure remember the rhythm of prayer? Can silence be more precise than sound? And if a bell rings in the night with no hand to guide it, whose hour has truly begun? Asterisk, they called her sister Merencia the listener, not in jest, not as a title, but as a quiet acknowledgement spoken softly in dormitory whispers or during the final prayers before sleep. She had once been the ringer of the great bell of St. Erilda. Now she was its translator, its companion, the one who understood what no mechanism could. The bell no longer needed prompting. Not always. It would ring of its own accord, but only when the time was right, not according to the sun or to the sundial, or even to the candle that Sister Bruna still insisted on watching. It rang when silence had settled just deeply enough, when prayers had been spoken with just the right weight, when the convent's pulsat's hidden rhythm matched some ancient memory embedded in bronze. And if the mood was broken, if there had been arguing in the kitchen, or a novice cried into her pillow, or the sisters sang off-key with forced cheer, the bell would not ring. Not at Mat, not at Lord's, not even at Comp, L-I-N-E. It would wait, and the sisters would feel it. A void where tone should be. A pause in the breath of the building. A quiet disappointment. And that, more than any scolding, brought them back to center. Asterisk. By Merencia's third decade in the convent. The bell had only grown more strange. Its sound changed with the seasons. In summer, it rang high and bright sharp enough to wake the bees. In winter, it was low and thick, as though muffled by frost. But even that wasn't the oddest part. It was the resonance. After it rang, the walls themselves seemed to hum. Not a literal vibration, but something felt in the soles of the feet, the backs of the teeth. It was a tone that stayed with you, that colored the silence that followed it. Sister Jezebel, now nearly a full-grown nun, once said, "It's like the bell leaves behind a shadow made of sound." Merentia had no better explanation. And then the storm came. A great wind from the northwest. Rain fell sideways. The tower stones wept. Lightning cracked across the valley. A bolt struck the edge of the abbey wall and split a corner of the chapel roof. The bell, though high in the tower, was untouched. But it did not ring for 3 days, even when the skies cleared, even when the air grew still. It sat, silent and inert, like a mute prophet. Sister Bruna tried ringing it manually on the 4th morning. The sound came, but it was hollow, uncertain. It died too quickly. It's just tired. Someone said, "It's listening," said Merencia. She ascended the tower that evening alone. The wind had stilled. The stones were dry. The rope hung slack. She touched it gently, still warm. She whispered, "You may ring, if you wish," and waited. The sun dipped behind the trees. The shadows lengthened, and then softly dash bong, dot 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 bong, dot 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 bong, dot dot dot, 3 notes. Not for a specific prayer, not part of the office, just an announcement. I am still here. And then silence. After that, the bell resumed its rhythm, but changed. It no longer rang for all 8 canonical hours, only for the most sacred 3, matins, vespers, and compline, the others. The sisters kept by breath and habit, but when the bell did speak, it rang with perfect tone, as if it had rested, remembered, and returned with clarity. It was no longer a bell of instruction. It was a bell of consent. As Sister Merentia aged, her steps slowed. She no longer climbed the tower. Others did it for maintenance, but none rang the bell. They didn't need to. She spent most of her time in the cloister garden, seated on a carved stone bench, eyes half closed. Sometimes novices asked her for stories about the bell. She never told them everything. Only this: when the bell rings, it is not calling you. It is joining you. In her final season, she began waking just before the bell. She would open her eyes moments before the note, whisper a single line of psalm, and then smile as the first tone rolled out across the stone. She once told Sister Jezebel, "It rings in my bones now. I don't need ears anymore." She passed quietly during compline, during the pause between the final chant and the extinguishing of the candles. The bell did not ring for 3 days, and then, at dawn, it tolled 12 slow times, each note spaced like a breath. The abbess wept, the novices knelt, and the birds, without warning, began to sing. They buried her beneath the tower. No plaque, only a single chime etched into the stone wall. and a new tradition began. Once a year, on the anniversary of her passing, no bells were rung, no clocks watched. The sisters prayed by instinct, by memory, by rhythm, and somehow every time they knew exactly when to stop. Reflection. Can memory live in metal? Can a bell, forged for prayer, learn the breath of the ones who listen? And when it finally falls silent, could it be that it's simply waiting for the right moment to begin again? Asterisk in the winter of 1182. At a quiet convent tucked into the limestone cliffs of southern Burgundy. Time was kept not by bells or sun or beans, but by candles. This was not uncommon. In places where sundials failed and bells rusted, wax became the ruler of the day. Each hour was marked by the burning of a carefully measured candle. A full candle might burn for 6 hours, a half candle, 3. Quarter candles were used for pauses in between, and for nearly 2 decades, the nuns of St. Leoba's Abbey lived by their candles without complaint, until one morning the wax began to lie. It started subtly. The prime candle always lit precisely, bend out 20 minutes early. The next day, it lasted nearly 40 minutes too long. The wax was the same, the wick the same length, but something was off. Prayers were rushed, then delayed. Chants were clipped short or dragged to long. Sister Genevieve, the convent's cellarer, blamed poor wax batches from the nearby monastery. They've been adding too much tallow, she muttered, or worse, beeswax from hives that sleep too early. Sister Hilda, the sacristan, blamed the novices. They breathe too hard, she snapped. That's why the flame flickers, sister. Agnes, responsible for lighting the prime candle, said nothing. She had followed the same routine for 14 years. She trimmed the wick to the same half-inch, shielded the flame with her palms, and placed it in the same clay holder beneath the stone arch. But it no longer burned the way it once did. Soon, sides formed. The wax purists, led by Sister Genevieve, demanded stricter controls on the wax formula. They argued that the candles had grown soft, literally and spiritually. They began melting down old votives to test their purity. The wick observants, under Sister Hilda, insisted. But the issue lay in trimming. Wicks, they claimed, had grown too wild. A wick left to its own devices burns its own path. Hilda wrote in a chalk note on the storeroom door. The abbess, caught in the middle, sighed quietly. This is not a war, she said, but it was candles. Began disappearing. First from the sacristy, then from the infirmary. Finally, even the altar tapers were replaced, some shorter, some fatter, some suspiciously sweet-smelling. Someone was conducting unannounced burn trials. A novice was caught red-handed, using one of the chapel candles to boil rosemary. Tea in her cell. That did not go unnoticed. Discipline was swift. The abbess demanded all candles be catalogued and standardized. We serve God in flame, she said, not chaos. But no 2 candles burned alike. Not anymore. The real shift came when Sister Agnes, who had, until then, remained neutral, began her own experiments. She didn't declare them. She simply began recording. temperature, breeze, humidity, even prayer volume. And she discovered something deeply unsettling. The more joyful the chant, the faster the candle burned. She thought it might be coincidence, but it wasn't. Days when the sisters sang with gusto, feast days, celebration of saints. Prime candle burned faster, when the mood was somber and fast days, after illness. During tension it burned slower. She tested it on one day. She asked the choir to hum the hymn instead of sing it. The candle slowed. On another, she requested louder voices. It sped up. She wrote it down. The wax responds to joy. She shared this quietly with the abbess, who responded, "That's theology, not science." But the flame listens. Agnes replied. "No," said the abbess gently. "We listen to the flame." But word spread, and suddenly the Wicfer Siswax argument evolved. Now there was a third camp, the mood theorists. They claimed the candle measured not time, but tone. And so prayers were whispered with caution. Smiles were dimmed. Joys muted. The idea took root. Too much happiness makes the day shorter. The abbess tried to end it. She declared that from now on, only marked candles scored with hourly lines would be used. Regardless of burn rate, the line would indicate when the prayer should end. But that didn't work either. On windy days, the lines blurred. On cold days, they never reached the second mark. A feast day once ended in scandal when a celebration candle burned through 3 marks in a single meal. Sister Genevieve declared, "The candles are resisting us," and no one laughed. It was Sister Agnes who finally proposed an odd solution. "Let the candles tell us when to stop," she said, "not the other way around." The abbess blinked. "Let wax rule prayer." "No," Agnes said. "Let the flame reflect it." And so a compromise was born. Instead of measuring hours by how long the candle should burn, they began marking the moment it flickered for the 3rd time. The 3rd flicker rule, they called it. It became a quiet tradition. When the prime candle flickered thrice, the sisters bowed their heads and closed prayer. No one spoke of it outside the convent. They feared mockery, but it worked. Every sister learned to watch the flame not for length, but for life. Reflection. What if time cannot be measured in inches of wax? What if a flickering flame tells us more than a fixed clock ever could? And in watching it, are we keeping time more being kept by it? Asterisk, they said. The flame never lies, but they never said it tells the truth in words. After the 3rd flicker, rule was quietly adopted at St. Leoba's Abbey. Something curious settled over the convent's sense that time had become both more personal and more mysterious. No longer was it measured in exact minutes or rigid segments. Instead, it hovered in the flicker of a flame, a glow, a pause. Each candle became a living thing. Sister Agnes, once the quietest nun in the cloister, found herself becoming a kind protopodure of watcher. She didn't invent the flicker rule. Not truly it had happened through observation, not intention, but the sisters began turning to her for guidance. Did it flicker? They'd whisper during Lauds. Twice, she'd answer, "Wait for one more." Sister Hilda, the former enforcer of wicked trimming codes, was not pleased. "This is chaos wrapped in ritual," she muttered one evening. "The flame is not a prophet." But her voice lacked its former sharpness. Even she had seen the uncanny precision of the flicker. Always 3, never 2. Always soft, never dramatic. Sometimes barely visible, but always ... there. The abbess, though skeptical, had allowed it. The rhythm of the convent had stabilized. Prayers no longer felt rushed. Meals returned to balance. And most curiously, the sisters themselves moved more slowly, more deliberately, as if the very idea of time had softened. They didn't watch the sun anymore. They watched the flame. Agnes began keeping a wax diary, not of thoughts or dreams, but of candle behaviors. She charted everything. When the flame curved left, when it trembled for no reason, when the third flicker arrived early or late. One entry read, "Clouds all day." Third flicker came slower. Chant had dragged. One sister wept. Candle knew. She didn't share her diary, but it grew thick. She began testing different waxes. Beeswax burned soft and steady. Tallow, though frowned upon, flickered more often but less meaningfully. She once tried a candle made from leftover chapel stubs. Melted together, it never flickered at all. She threw it away. That autumn, a new novice arrived, Sister Adela, just 16. Nervous, wide-eyed, she struggled to follow the flow of the divine office, always a step behind in the chants, always lighting the wrong taper. Once, she trimmed a wick so short it drowned in wax. Agnes noticed. She took Adela under her wing. "Tend the candles," she told her, "but don't rush them. Let them breathe." Adela looked confused. "Candles don't breathe." "They do," Agnes replied. "Just not the way you think." Under Agnes's guidance, Adela learned to see the flame's language. A sudden dart meant draft. A steady glow meant readiness. A faint halo meant trust. She began recording her own notes, not as a scholar, but as a companion. She gave the candles names. Mara flickered boldly. Clemens took his time. Orla danced without provocation. The abbess disapproved. This borders on superstition. But the flame never disobeyed, and as Adela grew more comfortable, the candles began flickering in ways Agnes hadn't seen before. One night, during Compline, Adela's candle flickered 5 times. Agnes marked it down. 5 flickers, Adela leading chant. Sound was unusually sweet, room warmer than usual. Is joy contagious to wax? And then came the incident of the 4th candle. The convent had received a shipment of votive candles from a neighboring abbey, gifts for the Feast of All Saints. They were beautiful, thick, cleanly molded, each one etched with an image of a saint in gold leaf. Sister Genevieve lit one during Vespers. It burned blue, not for long, just a flicker, but blue. And then the flame split in 2, not separate, forked. The sisters gasped. Even the abbess leaned in. "It's a sign," someone whispered, but Agnes stepped forward. "No," she said, It's a mismatch. This wax doesn't know us. She let it burn, counted silently. No flickers, just the steady twin flame. She replaced it with one of their own. Within seconds, one flicker, then two, then three. The sisters exhaled together. That night, Agnes wrote, foreign wax doesn't speak the same tongue. Our rhythm is ours. She began wondering if candles could be trained, or if, perhaps, the convent itself taught them. Maybe it wasn't the wax that learned, but the space around it. Maybe the walls remembered. Maybe time wasn't stored in clocks or charts, but in the echo of footsteps, the hush of paused breaths, the warmth of old prayers absorbed by stone. And then something strange happened. The third flicker began arriving before the prayer ended. Not often, but enough to notice. At first, Agnes thought it was a draught, or perhaps a breath too strong. But it repeated. The flicker arrived early, as if ... anticipating. She adjusted the chants, shortened them by a line. Still early ... Sister Adela noticed it too. It's trying to help, she said, like it wants. To match us. No, Agnes whispered. It wants us to match it. By now, the flicker rule was practiced silently, instinctively. No announcements, no signals. A flicker, a pause, a bow. It had become a form of consenter, packed between flame and prayer. But the early flickers raised questions. Had the candles begun to lead? Was the flame measuring the soul of the moment, not the schedule? And if so, had they taught the candle, or had the candle taught them? Reflection. Is it still a timekeeper if it knows the hour before you do? Can rhythm, once shared long enough, become mutual understanding? And when flame and breath move as one, who is guiding whom? Asterisk by the first frost of winter. The candles at St. Cleopa's Abbey had become more than tools. They were companions, confidants, perhaps even keepers of secrets. Not because they performed miracles. There were no healings, no visions, but because they responded subtly, silently, and always in rhythm. Sister Agnes, now in her 50s and known by everyone as the Flamekeeper, kept her notes in a folded leather pouch beside her rosary. She had stopped tracking minutes long. Instead, her pages were filled with observations like Matins candle side during pause after sun. Third flicker came mid-tears. The others didn't notice, but the flame did. Or Adela's candle bowed slightly toward her during confession. Not wind. No one else moved. It bowed. The abbess had stopped questioning Agnes. Sometimes surrender is not defeat, but reverence. One evening, during the octave of Christmas, the sisters gathered for compline. The sky outside had dropped a fine veil of snow. The walls were quiet. No breath stirred the incense smoke curling upward. The candle was lit, all watched. They began the prayer. A warm flicker, one. A few lines later, another two. And then, just before, the usual third. Nothing, no flicker. They waited. A breath. Still no flicker. The chant continued awkwardly. Whispers fluttered like moth wings. In the dark, the abbess gestured silently for calm. But the candle stood firm, still, unmoving. It burned evenly bright, unwavering, but mute. Sister Adela, now a young woman, approached. She knelt by the candle, eyes low, and began to hum. Not a chant, not a hymn, just a single, slow note, a sound of offering, not instruction. And as the final breath of her hum faded, the third flicker came, small, gentle, just enough. The room exhaled, and the candle continued its burn as if nothing had happened. After that night, things changed. No longer did the sisters wait for the third flicker. Only they began to offer something first. A note, pause, a breath held with intention. The candles didn't just respond to time. They responded to tone, not musical, but emotional. Some sisters said the candles now waited until they meant their prayers. A late flicker was no longer seen as failure. It was correction, not punishment, just invitation to be present. Agnes recorded it all. She wrote in her diary, "The flame is not a mirror, it is a gate. When we pray from the throat, it listens. When we pray from the chest, it replies. But only when we pray from the belly does it bow." She began teaching novices not just how to tend the flame, but how to approach it. "Don't expect it to obey," she whispered. "Invite it to trust you." They learned to bow not out of ritual, but out of habit, out of respect, out of rhythm. It was Sister Bruna, once the strictest among them, who said something unexpected. She was walking past the chapel one morning after prime, where Adela stood trimming a fresh candle. Bruna paused at the door and said, not unkindly, "Be careful, child. You stare at that flame like it might answer. You." Adela looked up. "It already does," she said softly. The abbess passed that spring. Her final words were not to a nun, but to the candle burning beside her bed. She looked at it for a long moment and whispered, "Tell them to wait for the third," and then she was gone. The candle flickered 3 times in silence, each flick perfectly spaced, measured, merciful. After her passing, a small alcove was carved into the chapel wall to hold a single candle. It was never lit by clock or bell, only when the sisters felt it was time, and somehow it always was. That candle became known as the Concord flame, not because it created peace, but because it reminded them what peace felt like, when breath matched breath, when silence had weight, when the third flicker came at just the right moment. Years later, a visitor from a nearby priory asked Sister Adela if they used a mechanical clock. She smiled. "No," she said, "we burn time." He laughed, thinking it a joke, but she didn't. Reflection. Can a candle decide when you are ready to pray? If flame and silence are both alive, might they simply be waiting for us to listen? And when that third flicker comes gently, patiently, without fanfare, could it be that time itself is bowing to presence? Sister Clemencia, was the kind of nun people noticed only when she was not where she was supposed to be. She was not loud, not disobedient, not odd in any visible way. She simply never arrived at the right hour. At Lord's, she came during Terci. At Nun, she appeared just as Vespers began. She walked slowly, head tilted, as if waiting for a sound that never came. The others whispered kindly behind her back. She has her own calendar, they said. Perhaps her soul is too quiet to hear the bells. She was not senile, not confused, just uneswised. It was not always this way. Asterisk. When she first arrived at St. Gertrude's Priory at the age of 19, she had followed every hour with devotion. She rose with the others. She fasted. She rang the bell on time when asked. But something changed during her third year. A winter, with heavy snow, a missed matins bell, a lingering cough that turned into a silence. No one was sure what triggered it. But after that season, she never seemed to meet the hour again. She insisted she was following time, but it was her time, not the convent's. The abbess, a practical woman with a soft voice and firmer hands, tried to accommodate her at first. Just follow the bells, she said. I do, Clemencia replied, but they speak to me late. You mean you don't hear them? No, she said. I hear them after I am already moving. That was when the abbess realized Clemencia wasn't ignoring the bells. She was arriving before them. Not always, but often. She was early, but only sometimes. Sister Magdalene, the sacristan, once caught Clemencia lighting candles in the chapel 15 minutes before Lord's. The bell hasn't rung, she said sharply. I know, said Clemencia, placing her hand near the flame. But it's already here. What is the hour? Magdalene left her alone after that. She began to keep a quiet log, not of prayer times, but of the moments she felt the hour arrive. She could not explain it, but certain moments shimmered, not with light, but with shape. It feels like the air changes, she told the novice mistress once, like a fabric being pulled into place. Her body responded before the bells. Not always, but on clear days she would wake and know it is none. She'd dress, walk to the cloister, open the chapel door, and 15 minutes later the bell would ring behind her. The sisters found this unsettling. Not her presence, but her anticipation. One novice whispered, she walks through time like it's water. Another, maybe her soul remembers the hour before her mind does. They didn't laugh. There was nothing funny about it. Sister Clemencia began spending more time in the garden. She said the plants understood her timing. I know when the sun shifts, she said to Sister Colette, the gardener. Even when it's cloudy, the leaves tell me. Colette thought it nonsense until she noticed that Clemencia always came to water the herb beds. Minutes before the shadows changed direction, she would stand, hands folded, and wait, and then the wind would turn. The abbess tried one last time to bring her into rhythm. Try using the candle clock, she offered. Watch the line melt. That will ground you. Clemencia obeyed, but the candle flickered strangely in her presence. The wax melted slower or faster. It confused her more. She stopped, and then, one morning in Lent, the bells failed altogether. A winter storm had damaged the tower rope. The sisters gathered late, the rhythm broken, but Clemencia had already been in the chapel for prime, and later for sext, and again for compline. Without a single bell, the abbess noticed. You did not need the call. Clemencia shook her head. The hour calls itself. From that day, a strange reverence formed around her. The novices began to follow her footsteps, not to mimic her, but to check their own sense of time. Is it terse? They'd whisper. It is, Clemencia would say gently. You'll feel it in your chest, not in your watch. She never claimed to be right. She never argued when others corrected her. But quietly, patiently, she continued, showing up when she felt the hour arrive, never needing to be told. Reflection. What if time doesn't begin when the bell rings but when someone is ready to receive it? What if rhythm is not something we hear, but something we feel? And what happens when a person steps so gently through the world that even time forgets to rush them? Asterisk. Sister Clemencia had no timepiece, no candle marked with hours, no tally of prayers scratched on wax tablets, no shadow watching, no rope to pull. And yet she was rarely wrong. After the bell rope froze and snapped for the second time that spring, the abbess stopped pretending it was temporary. The bell ringers had done what they could, patched the frayed hemp, adjusted the pulley butt. The rhythm of the abbey remained off-kilter. The convent needed timekeepers. Several sisters volunteered. Sister Magdalene with her wax markers, Sister Odelia with her hourglass from a ruined monastery. Even Sister Beatrix suggested simply counting aloud with steady breath. 1 Hail Mary equals 30 heartbeats, she said confidently. But it was Sister Clemencia, the abbess, watched most closely, not because she sought attention, but because she never seemed to need permission to move. The abbess called her in one afternoon. Do you believe time is a gift? She asked. Clemencia tilted her head. No, I think it's a garment. A garment, yes, she said. We wear it some too tightly, some too loose. I try to let it rest lightly. The abbess blinked and said nothing. She began walking the cloister paths, more deliberately, not because she was told to, but because others began watching her pace. She had no intention of leading, but rhythm leaves footprints, and hers were steady dot. She would begin moving toward the chapel just as the light changed against the eastern wall. Not dramatic, just a softening, as though the sun had exhaled, and somehow that movement felt more certain than the bell. The younger nuns began to mimic her. They didn't say so aloud, but they began to gather when she gathered, rise when she rose. They stopped watching. The clocks borrowed from visiting monks. They stopped measuring candles to the half-inch. They waited for Clemencia's steps, or her silence. If she remained seated after look, they knew the next hour had not yet turned. If she stood by the door with her hands folded, they followed. The abbess noticed, and one morning she walked with Clemencia before prime. You know you're leading them, she said. I'm only following what's already here, Clemencia replied. What is here? The bend of the hour, she said simply. The slope of silence. Sister Clemencia once described it this way. It feels like walking through cloth. Each hour has a different texture. Terse is like linen. Sext, more like wool. Nun, bathe is the weight of a damp towel. Vespers is velvet. They didn't laugh, because when she said it, they knew exactly what she meant. One day, a novice asked her, "How do you know it's time?" Clemencia paused. "It isn't that I know," she said. "It's that I stop needing to wait." That answer became a kind of cone among the novices, not a riddle, a doorway. By midsummer, no one spoke of the missing bell. It hung there still. Of course, a silent crown above the cloister, but it was no longer needed. Time arrived like a friend, not a summons. The abbess eventually issued a quiet decree. Sister Clemencia is not our timekeeper, she said, but she is our mirror. Each nun, she explained, had to find her own hour again, not by listening for commands, but by listening to the walls, the wind, the breath of others, like Clemencia did. And yet, even she admitted there were days she lost the rhythm. Storms unsettled her. Illness blurred the textures. Grief, like the passing of Sister Jezebel, could bend the hour until it cracked. But even then, she returned, not to correctness, but to presence. She'd feel it again in the soft twitch of the garden, leaves in the creak of chapel pews, in the moment when everyone paused at once, but no one had spoken. That was when she knew it was time. Reflection. Is time something that happens to us all with us? If we stopped looking at clocks, would our bodies remember the rhythm of the world? And when one soul moves quietly enough, can it carry an entire community with it? Asterisk by her 25th year at St. Gertrude's Priory, Sister Clemencia was no longer spoken of as odd. She had become something else, not revered, not feared, simply trusted dot when visitors came bishops, scribes, curious layfolk with their ink-stained books of canonical hours. They would ask who kept time here, with no ringing bell, no dial, no sandglass, and the abbess would gesture, always calmly, to the figure in the far end of the cloister. Her. "That's Sister Clemencia," she'd say. "She doesn't tell time. She walks it." And it was true. Her steps had become the convent's silent metronome. She walked the garden path at Lourdes, sat beneath the south window during terce, paused by the chapel door for sext. Her rhythm was so unbroken that the bees near the rosemary hedge seemed to match her pace. Even the doves on the rooftop stirred when she stood. She never explained it, and the sisters stopped asking. One of the novices, Sister Amata, began sketching her movements on parchment, not out of idolatry but curiosity. She drew soft arcs, footprints, dots where Clemencia paused. Over time, she noticed a pattern. Each route curved around the convent in a figure that resembled the old circular clocks from cathedral towers, a spiral made of steps, not ticks. She showed it to the abbess. "It's not just walking," she whispered. "It's turning." The abbess nodded asterisk. She's never moved in a straight line. She said Clemencia, of course, knew none of this. Or if she did, she gave no sign. She only said once, in confession, I feel most out of place when I walk towards something. It's easier when I walk with it. By. And then came the solar eclipse. No one had expected it. The convent had no astronomers, no predictions. Just a sudden, strange dimming at sext. Light turned grey. Shadows vanished. The birds stopped singing. Time dash, visually, at least, seemed to pause. But Clemencia stood up and walked right on time. She moved down the cloister, turned past the refectory, stepped into the chapel. The flame from the Vespers candle danced, though the air was still. And when the sky brightened again, the other sisters were already gathered behind her. No one had spoken. No one had planned. They had simply followed. After that, the abbess began calling her by a new name in private, not Sister Clemencia, she said, but Domina Horath, the Lady of the Hour, only in jest, but only partly, because the truth was, Clemencia now carried the hours within her. Her final year was quiet. She slept more, walked less, but even in bed, even in stillness, her breath followed the rhythm. It was said she would murmur parts of the divine office in her sleep, exactly on time. A single verse from Lords at the proper hour, a sigh from Camplin just before the moon reached the wall. And when she died on, a windless morning in early length, the sisters gathered in silence. There was no bell. There hadn't been one in years. And yet they rose, dressed, prayed, at the right hour dot without being told. Her grave was unmarked. That was her request. But the abbess planted a sundial nearby, not for reading, but for stillness. The dial had no numbers, only a single word etched at the base, breath, and every year on the anniversary of her passing. The sisters observe what they call the day of shadowless hours. They hide all timepieces, walk without destination dot, pray without bells, and eat when their stomachs ask. A day not without structure, but without measuring. And every year, just before Camplin, someone stands in the garden, lifts their head, and says, "It's time." And it always is. Reflection. What if time is not something we keep, but something that keeps us? What if the truest rhythm is not marked by metal, or flame, or chime, but by the quiet steps of someone who simply never left it behind?